Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dive into something you might find really, really useful.
Okay.
It's called the bias-free framework.
Oh, interesting.
So imagine having a tool that helps you spot hidden biases in any kind of information.
Wow.
And that's what this framework does.
All right.
You sent over some really interesting excerpts.
Mm-hmm.
One from a 2006 book by Burke and Margaret Eichler,
Yep.
outlining the framework itself.
Right.
And another from a 2023 article by Gregor Wolbring
Okay.
that looks at using the framework in science and tech education.
I see.
So it seems like you're really interested in making sure that the information you're taking in
Yeah.
is accurate and inclusive.
Yeah, that's a great goal to have. And you're right, the bias-free framework is all about recognizing how social hierarchies can sneak into the information we consume and sometimes even distort the picture entirely.
It's like having a built-in filter to help you separate fact from cleverly disguised opinion, right?
Exactly. So let's unpack what the bias-free framework actually is.
Okay, let's do that.
At its heart, it's a system for analyzing information for those hidden biases that stem from social hierarchies.
Yeah.
One of the really cool things about it is that it's captured in this catchy acronym,
Okay.
building an integrative analytical system for recognizing and eliminating inequities.
So bias-free is literally the goal.
Yes, I love that.
It is. But it's important to remember, as the authors point out, that bias-free is the ideal we're aiming for.
Yeah.
Not necessarily where we all start. We all carry biases.
Right.
It's human nature.
Sure.
The key is becoming aware of them so we don't let them control how we understand the world.
And that's where the framework comes in.
Yes.
It gives us that structure to start recognizing our own biases.
Yeah.
Now, in the book, Burke and Eichler talk about a bias triangle. Can you break that down for us?
Absolutely. Picture a triangle.
Okay.
Each point represents a different type of bias problem
Okay.
that we often encounter. Okay, I'm visualizing it.
Correct.
What's the first point on the triangle?
That would be maintaining a hierarchy, or H for short.
Okay.
This one can show up in a few different ways.
Okay.
Sometimes it's straight up denying that a hierarchy exists. Other times, it's presenting the dominant view in a hierarchy as the norm,
Right.
making it seem like there's no other way to think about it. Or it could even go as far as pathologizing or putting down non-dominant groups.
So it's like when people say boys will be boys.
Yes.
As if that explains away certain behaviors without considering the underlying power dynamics at play.
That's a great example. It's a subtle way of maintaining a hierarchy by making it seem natural or inevitable,
Right.
rather than acknowledging that it's a social construct that can be challenged.
It's amazing how these things can fly under the radar if you're not actively looking for them.
Exactly. And that's why having a framework like this is so helpful.
Yeah.
It helps us develop that critical lens.
Okay, so we've got maintaining a hierarchy covered. What's the next point on the triangle?
Next up, we have failing to examine differences, or F.
Okay.
This happens when we lump diverse groups together as if they're all the same, ignoring important social or biological differences.
So instead of celebrating the uniqueness and diversity within groups, we just slap on a generic label and call it a day.
Unfortunately, yes.
Wow.
And that can lead to some serious misunderstandings.
Right.
Like the book mentions how early research on the benefits of aspirin focused only on men, which led to misleading conclusions about its effectiveness for women.
Okay.
It turns out there are real biological differences in how men and women respond to certain medications.
Right.
If you don't account for those differences, you end up with incomplete and potentially harmful information.
Wow. That's a great example of how this kind of bias can have real-world consequences.
It can.
Okay, so we've got H and F down.
Would you?
What's the final point on our bias triangle?
My last point is using double standards, or D. This one is all about treating groups differently when the same treatment would be totally appropriate.
Right.
We see this in the overrepresentation of one group or the exclusion of others.
Yeah.
Think back to how women were historically excluded from drug trials,
Right.
even though those very drugs were later prescribed to both men and D women.
Yeah.
It's a double standard with potentially dangerous outcomes.
Yeah, that's a huge issue.
It is.
It's like saying one group's experiences and health concerns are more important than another's.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can be really subtle.
Right.
Which is why it's so important to be vigilant. Now, here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Failing to examine differences and using double standards can be tricky.
Okay.
Sometimes you do need to treat groups differently.
Right.
Because there are real distinctions.
Okay.
But other times, treating them the same is crucial.
Got it.
To avoid reinforcing a hierarchy.
That's a really nuanced point.
It is.
It sounds like using this framework isn't just about checking boxes,
Right.
but actually thinking critically about the context.
Yes.
And the potential impact of our choices.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the question of how we actually use the bias-free framework. How do we put this into practice?
Right.
Think of it as a set of insightful questions.
Okay.
You can apply to any piece of information you come across.
So instead of just passively absorbing information,
Right.
we're actively engaging with it.
Yes.
And challenging its assumptions.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the three-dimensional matrix earlier.
Yeah.
That's a key part of the framework.
Okay.
It helps you map out the different layers of bias.
Okay. So I'm picturing this matrix.
Okay.
Walk me through it.
Okay.
How does it actually work?
You've got 3 dimensions to consider.
Okay.
First, you've got the type of hierarchy at play.
Mm-hmm.
Is it based on gender, race, socioeconomic status, ability, or something else?
Right.
Then you've got the specific part of the process you're analyzing.
Okay.
Are you looking at a research study, a news article, a policy document, or even just a casual conversation?
Wow.
Finally, you've got the bias problem itself.
Okay.
Are you seeing maintaining a hierarchy, failing to examine differences,
Right.
or using double standards?
So it's like a multi-layered detective game.
It is.
And I imagine it can get pretty complex because people belong to multiple hierarchies at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why using this framework is an iterative process.
Okay.
You might uncover layers of bias related to different hierarchies within the same piece of information.
This is fascinating. I'm starting to see how powerful this tool can be.
It is.
But let's connect this back to you, our listener.
Okay.
Why should you care about the bias-free framework?
Well, if you're someone who values quick and thorough learning, this framework is like a shortcut to critical thinking.
I like that.
It helps you hone in on those potential distortions and biases and assess information efficiently.
Right.
So you don't waste time wading through biased material.
Plus, think of those aha moments you get when you uncover something new or see things from a different perspective.
Yeah.
The bias-free framework can lead to a ton of those moments.
It's about seeing the world with fresh eyes.
Exactly. And it's not just about research, which is what we've been focusing on so far.
Right.
The Wolbring article specifically looks at how to apply the bias-free framework to education. He argues that it can be incredibly useful for evaluating things like textbooks and teaching materials. Imagine being able to identify hidden biases in the materials used to teach students.
I know.
It could radically change how people learn.
That's a great point. And it connects back to your interest in multiple perspectives and avoiding information overload.
Right.
By learning to spot these biases.
Yeah.
You become a more critical consumer of information.
Right.
You can filter out the noise and get to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
It's like having a mental toolkit for navigating the constant flow of information we face every day.
Right. And it's not just about filtering out the bad stuff.
Right.
It's about being able to identify and appreciate diverse perspectives and understand how those perspectives shape the information we receive.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about being critical. It's also about being open-minded and inclusive in our thinking.
That's a really important point. It's about using the framework to expand our understanding, not just shut things down.
I love that.
Yeah, so it's all about using this framework to dig deeper and get to a more complete picture of whatever you're exploring.
I love that. So it's not just about fact-checking. It's about context-checking, too.
Yes. Now, we've talked about the types of biases and the matrix, but I'm wondering, are you curious about what kinds of questions the framework actually encourages you to ask?
Absolutely. Can you give us a taste of what those questions look like in action?
Of course.
Yeah.
Let's take maintaining a hierarchy and think about how it might show up in research.
Sure.
One question the framework prompts us to ask is, does the research even acknowledge that this hierarchy exists? It seems simple.
Right.
But sometimes researchers overlook or downplay the power dynamics involved.
Right.
And that can really skew the results.
Right, like pretending that gender doesn't impact healthcare experiences when we all know it absolutely does.
That's a perfect example. And it makes me think of another question from the frameworks.
Okay.
Is the research unintentionally taking the perspective of the dominant group?
Right.
If it is, that could lead to a really limited understanding of the issue. Burke and Eichler give a great example from the World Health Organization.
Okay.
They point out that the traditional focus on mortality rates in healthcare actually disadvantages women.
Oh, how so?
Well, women tend to live longer, but experience higher rates of illness. So just focusing on death rates misses a huge chunk of the picture when it comes to women's health.
That's so interesting. It's like looking at a map
Yes.
that only shows half the terrain.
Exactly. And the framework helps us zoom out and see the whole picture.
Yeah.
And remember, it's not just about gender.
Right.
This framework applies to all kinds of social hierarchies. For instance, when it comes to race.
Yeah.
One of the questions the framework asks is the research using a double standard to define comparable facts about different racial groups?
Right.
This can be subtle, but really powerful.
The book mentions IQ tests as an example.
Yes.
They were often used to justify racial hierarchies by saying certain groups were just inherently less intelligent.
Right. But as Burke and Eichler point out, those tests were often manipulated.
Oh, wow.
To ensure certain racial groups scored higher.
Really?
Creating a hidden double standard.
So even seemingly objective measures can be biased?
They can.
That's wild.
It is. And it reminds us that we always need to be questioning those underlying assumptions, no matter where the information is coming from.
Okay, so we've seen how the framework can help us analyze the overall research design and interpretation of data. But what about the more specific parts of the research process, like the methods and the language used?
Those are super important too. Think about something as basic as a data collection form.
Like a survey or questionnaire?
Exactly. The book talks about hospital intake forms that ask for information about the patient's mother and father.
Oh, that seems pretty standard. What's the issue there?
Well, it assumes that everyone fits into that traditional family structure.
Right.
It doesn't account for same-sex parents, guardians,
Yeah.
or other family arrangements.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
It's a subtle way of excluding people who don't fit the norm.
Right. And the solution is actually quite simple.
Okay.
Just ask for parent 1 and parent 2 on the form.
It's inclusive and avoids making assumptions about people's lives.
That's a great example of how small changes can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another key part of the research process.
Oh, okay.
The language used in research papers, articles, and even textbooks.
Right.
The framework encourages us to look closely at whether the language is subtly perpetuating stereotypes or using biased terminology.
I can see how that would be important.
It is. In the Wolbring article,
Yeah.
he talks about how science textbooks often present the dominant viewpoint as normal and label anything that challenges that view as biased.
Okay.
Or political.
Right.
It's like they're trying to control what counts as legitimate knowledge.
It's like saying these are the facts.
Yes.
And anything else is just opinion.
Exactly. And it limits students' exposure to a wider range of viewpoints and ideas.
The book also gives the example of how men are often described as tall and women as short.
Yes.
Even though there's so much overlap in height between the sexes.
It's a false dichotomy that reinforces stereotypes.
It is. And those seemingly small language choices can actually contribute to larger societal biases.
Right.
The framework encourages us to move beyond those simple categories.
Yeah.
And acknowledge the complexity of human experience.
It's about nuance.
Yes.
Recognizing that people exist within multiple hierarchies.
Exactly.
And that their identities and experiences are multifaceted.
Exactly. We can't just box people in.
I'm really starting to see how this framework can help us become more critical thinkers.
Yes.
And more aware of the subtle ways bias can operate.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up,
Okay.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on what this all means for our listeners.
Sure.
How can they apply the bias-free framework in their own lives? It feels like we're giving our listeners a superpower. The power to see through those hidden biases that shape the information we encounter every day.
I like that analogy. It's about empowering you to become a more discerning and critical consumer of information. Start by paying attention to the language used.
Okay.
Are there any subtle biases or hidden power dynamics at play?
Right.
Then think about the source of the information. Who's being represented and whose voices are missing.
Yeah.
Finally, ask yourself how the information might be different.
Okay.
If it were presented from a different perspective.
It's like a mental checklist to run through whenever you encounter a new piece of information.
Right.
And once you start actively looking for these biases, you'll be surprised at how many you uncover.
It's like a whole new world opens up. You start to see things you never noticed before.
Are there any specific areas where you think applying this framework could be especially impactful for our listener?
One area that immediately comes to mind is healthcare.
Okay.
We know that healthcare disparities are a huge problem.
Right.
And biases in research, medical training, and even doctor-patient interactions can all contribute to those inequalities.
That makes a lot of sense. Imagine being able to spot potential biases in medical studies or question assumptions.
Yes.
Your doctor might be making based on your gender, race, or ability.
Exactly. It could empower patients to have more informed and productive conversations with their healthcare providers.
Yeah.
And it's not just about individual empowerment. It's also about advocating for larger systemic changes. By raising awareness of these biases, we can push for policies and practices that promote more equitable healthcare for everyone.
So it's a tool for both personal and societal transformation.
Absolutely. And think about all the other areas where this framework could be applied.
Okay.
Education, social services, the criminal justice system.
Right.
Anytime information is used to make decisions that impact people's lives, there's a potential for bias to creep in.
It's really like that universal decoder ring we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It helps us see through the distortions of bias.
Right.
And get to a more accurate and inclusive understanding of the world around us.
It's about recognizing that knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And that by understanding how bias operates, we can claim that power for ourselves.
Right.
And use it to create a more just and equitable world.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into the bias-free framework.
It has.
We've explored its theoretical foundations.
We have.
Delved into some real-world examples.
You did.
And even talked about how our listener can apply it in their own lives.
I know, it's been great.
So to wrap things up, we have one final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
Now that you're aware of the bias-free framework, I challenge you to start noticing how hierarchies might be influencing the information you encounter every day. Pay attention to the language used, the perspectives presented, and the assumptions being made. It's like a fun little game of spot the bias.
Yes.
And it can be incredibly insightful. You might be amazed at what you uncover.
It's a journey of discovery that can lead to a deeper understanding of yourself,
Sure.
the world around you, and the power of information.
Right.
So be curious, be critical, and enjoy the process of uncovering those hidden biases.